I was struck by the words in that song, "Will you let me answer prayer in you? Will you let me answer prayer in you?" God heard the cries of the people and called Moses to lead them out of the tyranny under Pharaoh. What's the prayers that God's hearing today? What context are we in that God would be wanting to answer a prayer in us? What's the prayer and what's the answer? And the Gospel reading reminds us that, and the Romans reading reminds us, if we're actually not just thinking about ourselves and thinking about others, then we might have a different request than if we're just thinking about for ourselves. Now, Alan Roxburgh has written a number of books, and at the moment he's got a podcast with a lady called Jenny, forget her surname, and it's called Out of Egypt. And what he's talking about is people engaging in mission and today. And they interview a number of people and talk about that. The one last week was actually talking about a gentleman from England that was talking about the pharaohs of today. Who are the pharaohs today? Remember, Pharaoh was the king, the boss, the one who was forcing the Israelites into hard labour, making them build bricks without straw, trying to cut down the number of male children so that they wouldn't grow very great in number. So what's the equivalent today? Who are the pharaohs today? In the podcast, they talk about a number of pharaohs, one of them being globalism. Some of those things that have power over us, that influence us. Almost that attitude that we're encouraged to have nowadays where I'm the most important person and what I think is right. That individual, the pressure to, in all sorts of ways, to have that attitude can be something that makes us a captive to the current age. What would be the pharaohs we would be thinking of today? I mean, it could even be for those who have got a home loan, there might be some people in making decisions about how much interest they pay, might see that as oppressive. It's the people that are feeling oppressed and the things that oppress. To actually understand behind the reading what's happening today. For us, for our community. But the other interesting thing, a book that I've been reading this week has been one that's called The Pastoral, Being a Pastor in a Secular Age. And it's too long to explain now, except one thing. Back in the old days, remember the churches used to have bells? That was before that's when you were actually able to ring them without having to get a permit, maybe. Back in the early centuries, the bells were actually not just to tell people it was time for church, he says. What he says, Anthony Root is the author. What he says is it was actually a reminder to people that the time is God's. That God is in control. That God is at work. And for all those things that people feared, the things that were too overwhelming for them, things that today we will explain away as we know why that has happened because of climate or because of weather or whatever it is, the things that they were concerned about, they really believed that some of those things happened because they had done things wrong. So the bell reminded them that God would forgive them and that God had control over things. So it was really a recognition that we're living in God's world and that God was involved in the world. Today, we don't have that same worldview across the whole world. Hence we call it, he writes about a secular age. And what he's describing is that our whole ministry over many centuries has changed from a time where, right back in the early stages, it was very much about we needed the priest to actually offer an offering or a prayer or a forgiveness. That's where we went. And what he's saying is that nowadays people don't feel the need to do that. They'd rather go to a psychiatrist, psychologist or a counsellor or someone like that if they've got an issue that they're struggling with. Now, I'm not saying that he's saying that that's wrong, but the worldview has changed and people are not just looking for the same things that they did in the past. So the way that we engage with people to remind them that God is around is different. So if Alan Roxburgh is right that there are a whole lot of pharaohs, which are the ones that we experience? Which are the ones that maybe hold us back from exercising the freedom that God would want to give us? And how do we care and respond with love in Romans to a community that is struggling? Now on Friday, Judy and I were going for a walk and I'm thinking, I need a break from this thinking about sermons on my day off. It's been a busy week. So we went to the shop and we've got two ways of going to the shop, well, more than two ways, but there's a quick way and there's a longer way. Now Judy's often conscious of, how many steps have I done today? She often wants to go the long way and sometimes I'm thinking, I'm happy to go the short way. But being a good husband, you know what I decided? You don't? We went the long way. Now, by going the long way, we actually found something on the footpath that I had not seen before. Yep, it could be a lizard. Yeah, it's sort of a bit hard to tell, isn't it? Hopefully it's not a snake. But it looks a bit bumpy to be a snake. Too small for a snake, it's not long enough, is it? Okay, so Judy stood there and I went home and got my camera. Wasn't she good? Because she didn't want anyone to scare it away or to run over it till I got my camera. So then we took, and next one's a photo of a bit closer. So what is it? Caterpillars. What type of caterpillars? Spitfires, yes. Okay. Next one. So trying to get a photo of all these little things together. These bugs together. Next one. This one's a video. Oops, it was a video. To show them moving. Now, we wondered, that goop that's coming out of whichever end that's coming out of, wondered whether that was poisonous or what it was. But they were actually connected together trying to go across the concrete. And of course, where do they normally live? In a eucalypt tree. And I realised afterwards, I've seen them in a eucalypt tree. So they don't... Yeah, so there's some movement that's happening. And there's a close-up of the little legs and the way they're going. Now, we thought they're very vulnerable here. This is the bike path and the walking path. Not everyone looks down where they're going. What's the next one, Barb? So someone went past and said, oh, they're Spitfires. I thought, well, that was a good clue. So I got my phone out and looked up Spitfires, and there we go. They usually feed on gum leaves at night. During the day, they live in large groups, up to hundreds, clustered together on the branches of a eucalypt tree. They live in these clusters to protect themselves from predators like birds. It's a bit like a church, isn't it? You could make all sorts of connections and analogies to the congregation being together and supporting each other and how that enables us to to keep each other safe from some of the things that might threaten us. The next one. Now, eventually, they don't build a cocoon, they become sawflies. And it just is something that comes out of the body, goes apart, and the sawflies come out. And they actually only live from 7 to 9 days, sawflies. So if you've seen a sawfly, you're doing pretty well, because they're hard to pick up. Next one. We turned aside and looked at that site, and I think there is a whole lot of things that potentially God might be saying to us, saying to me, but even saying to us as a congregation, as we gather together to be supportive of each other, to enable us to live in a world. But Jesus reminds us that if we live in the world to protect ourselves, then we actually lose our life in some ways. Because we're here, when we give our life to God, God makes our life something different. We can become the answer to the prayer that's in us if we allow God to call us to do something different, to see where God's at work around us, and to be aware of those ways in which we, in our own small part, might be called to bring the love of God, the setting free potential of the Spirit to people. Really, that's the key thing that we are called to do as disciples. It's about the way that we embody God's presence, live that love, and share that love, and help people to be set free as God works through us. May we look aside as God speaks to us. May we listen for the call for us. For Moses, there was a whole lot of things in his life that made him the right person to do the job that God was calling him to do, even though he said, no. There are things in our experience that God wants to use in the healing and bringing work of his kingdom in this world. How will we respond to that call?